Transgendered community in Hawaii is an interesting storyline. There was a lot of discussion about what was the role of Mahu in old Hawaiian culture and how Hawaiian culture was more accepting of gender and sexual variance. And there's some revival of that concept today, but for the most part, the transgender community as a discrete community and culture seems to have evolved from about the late 50s moving into the 60s and the 1970s. And the Hawaiian cultural revival is something that mainly started in the 1970s and kind of helped a lot of transgendered people get into hula and other cultural things which they hadn't necessarily been involved in. There's a large percentage of the male-to-female transgendered people in Hawaii who are part Hawaiian. Not so many full Hawaiian, but a large percentage who are part Hawaiian. And that might be cultural. Today we're seeing more Japanese American and Chinese American and some other ethnic groups represented in the transgendered community. I think they were probably always there, but I think the level of acceptance may have changed today in 2014 from what it was when I came to Hawaii, certainly in 1974. Up until probably the 1980s, if you were male and had chosen to live as a female, your opportunities to survive in a square job, a legal job, were very, very limited. Very few girls did it. Almost all the people were working in prostitution. There was a time in around 1970 or 71 where they were required to wear a badge, which is quite famous. A badge which said "I'm a boy" on it, and this various different people who were around at that time who've given me various histories of it. That was before I got to Hawaii. But the most plausible discussion I've heard about that is there was allegedly a crime of intent to deceive, which meant that if you were out and you were looking like a girl and trying to have sex with men, you were intending to deceive them, and military men were, therefore having sex with males who appeared to be females. And of course, all the military, if they were asked by their officers, would say, "Oh, I was deceived. I didn't know," which may or may not be true. We don't know. But anyway, so this came up, and the judge told one of the defendants in this case, well, you can avoid being prosecuted if you just identify yourself somehow very clearly that you are a boy. And so the Glades showroom, which was a very popular place for transgendered entertainers, came out with this button for the transgender women to wear saying, "I'm a boy," and as long as they were wearing that, they wouldn't get arrested. It lasted for maybe as long as 2 years before it was declared unconstitutional. They threw that out. And things went back to pretty well normal. Sometime towards the end of the 70s, the militaries just took the point of view that they didn't want any of their personnel going to Chinatown for recreation, and they started getting directed to Waikiki. And a large part of the growth of prostitution in Waikiki is from military, as well, of course, of tourism. One of the big complaints about Waikiki prostitution is that it's bad for tourism, but the fact is it's the tourism who are providing the business for the prostitutes. They're the customers. So obviously it's part of the tourist industry, not separate. There are some transgendered women who work in Waikiki as streetwalkers, and they have their own little section of Kuhio where they work. But for the most part, the Waikiki streetwalkers are genetic females. In Chinatown, there's kind of a zoning that exists, so that for a long time the transgendered people had Merchant Street. Merchant Street was what was known as a high track. A track is an area that's walked by streetwalkers, an area that's designated, or that they designate. It's not designated by the government, it's designated by them as their kind of turf. Merchant Street was reserved for transgendered women who were working in prostitution who did not have hard drug problems. And the women who were working on Merchant Street, the transgendered women, were very strict about, keeping the drug addict girls off of that street, because the drug addict girls, the people who were really on, crack or meth, they didn't take care of themselves. They weren't dressed the way they should. They were looking kind of like they'd slept in park, which many of them had, and they just weren't welcome there. And so they had to work on what were known as the back streets, which is more towards the mortuary, River Street, that area. And if you went there, you'd get, if you were a date, a trick, you'd get someone who was not as pretty, not as well put together, and probably didn't want as much money. If you went to Merchant Street, you'd get, a nice selection of very attractive transgendered women. It's interesting about returning to this question of who the dates are for transgendered prostitutes. The overwhelming number of these are people who would normally be identified as heterosexual men. They're not gay men. Gay men are not attracted to transgendered women. They're attracted to men. Guys who look masculine, have muscles, that's what they're attracted to. They're not attracted to someone who looks like a woman in a dress, whether or not that has a penis. That's just, they don't see that, they're not attracted to it. We find that there is a certain subset of what would be normally identified as heterosexual men who are only attracted to women. They like, women's shapes, they like, breasts and pretty hair, but they have this thing about having a penis involved, and so they seem to like having sexual relations with a woman who has a penis. Quite a lot of men like that. Obviously they're not going to want to tell that to their drinking buddies. So a lot of times, if they do have that inclination and it's discovered, they claim they were deceived. Generally not true. Occasionally, some men are deceived, and that can lead to problems for the prostitute. I know people who have been engaged with a man during a date, a prostitution date, and the man find out that the prostitute is male and gets angry. One of my friends has been shot at with a shotgun. Luckily, the guy was not a very good shot, and she ran fast. I know that occasionally transgendered prostitutes are murdered, but we don't always know if that was the reason for the murder. Sometimes we know that the murderer is someone who has dated transgendered people before, so it may be some other reason. Drugs may be involved. So it can be a tough situation, but it's generally, in terms of prostitution in Chinatown, it's gotten worse for the girls who are down there. There are a couple things which are generally different from, say, the 1980s and even the early 90s. When I first got to know girls who were working down there in the early 90s, things were a lot safer. They were still dangerous. There's still violence out there, but there were a lot of transgendered women out there who'd have your back, basically. There's a real sense of sisterhood. There were rules. There was a zoning rule. There was people who could tell you what was safe and what was not. There was only a small fraction of the transgendered girls prostituting, say, in 1994, who were hardcore, drug addicts. We know that because we had some of the sex workers do, surveys at that time. So, for example, in 1994, of 36, regular transgendered streetwalkers in Chinatown, only 6 of them were hardcore addicts. The other 30 were marijuana and a little alcohol. Merchant Street qualified, what was called the penthouse, the high track. If you look at things in the last 10 years, there's basically no transgendered sex worker in Chinatown who's not a hardcore addict.